and welcome to ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shamagam. Welcome to a throwback edition of ACR Journals on Air. Today, we will discuss a manuscript published before anyone ever heard of COVID-19. So sit back, take yourselves back to a time when rheumatology was unmasked and life was simpler. The manuscript we will discuss today is myocardial inflammation measured using 18-fluorodeoxyglucose positron emission tomography, computed tomography, FDG PET-CT, is associated with disease activity in rheumatoid arthritis. It was published in Arthritis and Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm excited to be joined by the first author of the manuscript, Dr. Isabelle Amiguet. Dr. Amiguet received her medical degree at the Pierre and Marie Curie University in France. She completed her residency and fellowship in France before moving to the US and completing further residency training at the Mount Sinai Health System in New York. She then completed a rheumatology fellowship at Columbia University in New York City, which is where she conducted much of the work that we will discuss today. She's an academic rheumatologist by training and was on faculty at the National Jewish Health System for many years. She's now the CEO of a direct specialty care practice in Colorado. Dr. Amiguet is also the host of the podcast Unabridged MD, in which she engages people in thought-provoking discussions, bridging the intersection of life and medicine. Welcome to the show, Isabelle.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Vicky. It's such a pleasure to be here and to talk about, I think, my favorite study, really.
So you completed the work presented in this manuscript when you were a rheumatology fellow at Columbia. It involves a group of RA patients enrolled in a larger study called the Rheumatoid Arthritis Study of the Myocardium, or RHYTHM. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got very lucky that my mentor, I basically met Dr. Baton. She was at Columbia and it had been maybe 1 or 2 years. And I reached out to her and I asked her if I could do a little bit of a training there. She had moved from Hopkins to New York City, but I'd taken with her this really large study because Dr. Baton is very interested and she's really like at the forefront of the studies of the heart, any heart disease in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. I started just helping her on the project. And then we had this study that looked at the PET scan of the heart of patients with rheumatoid arthritis.
And so you reached out actually even before you were a fellow as an earlier
Yeah,
trainee? Oh,
yes.
amazing.
I don't know if you want to go into this right away, but
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. So I actually did my residency and fellowship in France before I moved to New York City. And I was already I would have been a rheumatology attending if I had stayed in France. When I moved to the US to be with my then husband, I basically just knew I wanted to be a rheumatologist. I love it. Like it's the best specialty in the world, right? I think after my internship, I reached out because I was like, I'm missing doing research in rheumatology. I really want to do some research. And so I reached out to Dr. Baton because I love rheumatology and I love rheumatoid arthritis. So I reached out to her and I think she saw the potential that I had as a resident. That's where the relationship started.
So that's a great story, and I hope it gives some confidence to some of our earlier trainees. Sometimes those cold reach outs are actually well worth doing. So tell us a little bit more about the background of this study and why looking for surrogate markers of preclinical or subclinical myocardial inflammation in patients with rheumatoid arthritis is essential.
So the idea here is that so we know that patients with rheumatoid arthritis have more heart disease, okay? And the question was, why is that so? And one of the idea in this study was like, is there ongoing inflammation that we are not seeing? A little bit like if you're looking at the joint of a patient, there is, florid synovitis, it's obvious. But sometimes you actually have to take your ultrasound to see if there is subclinical synovitis. It's kind of the same idea in the heart. Is it possible that there was inflammation that you didn't see? The design of the study had already been done before I came onto the project. But very astutely, Dr. Baton basically thought, okay, we're going to take patients who don't have cardiovascular disease. So the patients have to have no heart failure, no MI, coronary artery disease, none of those things, no shortness of breath, no chest pain. And we're going to take those and we're going to look at their heart. I think at first when they were at Hopkins, they were looking at through cardiac MRI. And then because she moved to Columbia University, she decided to do PET scan. And I personally love PET scan. But yeah, she decided to do PET scan because there was a very strong group at the time at Columbia University for PET scan. That's really where it started, looking at the inflammation of patients who had no cardiovascular disease, but had rheumatoid arthritis. So we could look if they had more inflammation than regular patients or regular people, and then also see if it was associated or not with their disease, their rheumatoid arthritis disease activity.
And there were two parts to this study, right? So you had this more extensive study where you looked at the myocardial FDG uptake, and then a little sub-study where you were trying to look at treatment intervention. Can you tell us about the study design?
It's a prospective study, and as every single prospective study, everyone knows here that it costs a lot of money because it takes a very long time to include those patients, and then you have to photo them. It just takes money. And then I think we wanted 150 patients. We got 119. We wanted 150 patients to be in the study to just look at the heart and sort of this photography of what's going on in the heart of patients with rheumatoid arthritis, right? And then because we know this, right? Like we like to do an intervention and see if there is any changes. We wanted to look if there was any changes after treatment. And the best patients would have been the one that would have needed step-up therapy. And then we wanted to look before step-up therapy and after step-up therapy. And since the TNF inhibitor, they are the reason I became a rheumatologist. I'm just like TNF inhibitor are sort of our revolution in rheumatoid arthritis. And so the TNF inhibitor, there used to be a black box warning for TNF inhibitor in patients with severe heart failure, because there was this question of does TNF inhibitor cause heart failure, which we don't think is the case anymore. But there was this question like, is it just decreasing the disease activity? And we know that triple therapy can decrease the disease activity. Or is TNF inhibitor better or worse for the heart inflammation of our patients, right? So basically, decreasing the disease activity, is that enough to decrease inflammation that we think is happening in the heart of our patient with rheumatoid arthritis? So while the study design was wonderful when you think of it, so we're going to get, I don't know, I can't remember how much we wanted, but maybe like 50 patients we wanted in this sub-study, and randomize them to the triple therapy versus the methotrexate plus TNF. So everyone had methotrexate, and then that's after methotrexate that we would have included them into the triple therapy versus TNF inhibitor. And then look at that and look if there was any difference. The thing is that it was actually very hard to include those patients, and that rightfully or not, like I think that a lot of rheumatologists prefer to start TNF inhibitor rather than starting patients on triple therapy. One of the reasons being that triple therapy takes a lot more time to get to remission, even though we know that after a year, it's sort of the same. At least in the US, right? Like it makes almost sense that rheumatologists are like, hey, we want to get our patients in remission faster. I think if you go in Europe, because it's single payer, maybe the government has a little bit more to say and says, hey, triple therapy has to be the first line first. But in the US, we have the choice. And so it was hard to include those patients. So then I think the blinding was removed, and we said, like, we just want to see the heart of patients who have stepped up their therapy. Like either it's triple or it's TNF inhibitor. So that's what we looked, and we looked at the changes of the heart by FDG PET scan before the step up and after 6 months after the step up therapy.
And in addition to the PET scan measurements, what other parameters did you look at in this study?
So we looked at the usual things. So the seropositivity with CCP, rheumatoid factor, the disease activity with CDAI, DAS28. We looked at the CRP, of course. We looked at if they had, I guess, just the description of the patient. And then in terms of the outcome, we looked at the disease activity of the patients, and we looked at if they had any changes of their echo findings. So the ventricular function, structure and function of the heart, as well as the interleukin 6. So in addition to the CRP, we also looked at the interleukin 6 and BNP, but that was all normal for everyone.
You kind of got to this, I think, in your discussion of treatment differences, both regionally within the US and then certainly worldwide. I was kind of surprised by how few of the patients were on TNF inhibitors and how many were taking prednisone and NSAIDs. And I wondered if you had thoughts or explanations as to why that might be.
Columbia University is in Harlem. So there's a vast majority of patients who are African American and Hispanic, a lot. I remember doing some clinics all in Spanish. It was kind of cool. My Spanish got better.
Yeah.
So I think that the first thing is to realize that our patients' population is different than, for example, when I moved to Denver, very different. We had a lot of patients who were seeing us after not seeing anyone for many years, or who had never been on any DMARD, who came from other countries and they were immigrant and they finally could be taken care of. So I think that's number one, to realize that our population was very different. That's probably the main thing, the main reason. Like, I was very shocked also when I moved to realize how many patients came from other countries and were only managed with prednisone. That was the first thing. And then the second thing is that we took everyone that did not have a cardiovascular disease, like we offered them to get in. And a lot of those patients came from the Fellows Clinic, actually. I think that they are a little bit of a different type of population than what you would see in other areas of New York City or the rest of the country, really.
What can you tell us about their baseline demographics and particularly disease activity scores at baseline in this patient population?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the big cohort, right? Like, so we had mostly women, 82%, and then we had non-Hispanic white, that was only 37%, if you think about it. Whereas there was non-Hispanic Black that was 15%, and we had 44% that were Hispanic. So that was like one of the things that was a little tricky, is some patients, when they're Hispanic, they're like, I'm Hispanic. I don't know what you mean by non-white or Black. I'm just Hispanic. In terms of their cardiovascular risk factor, so none of them, again, had any cardiovascular disease, but they did have some risk factors. So we had 44% that had been ever smoker. We only had 11% that were current smoker. But again, this is New York City, Harlem. I'm sure if you look at California, it would be like less than 5% of current smoker. We had close to 40% with hypertension, 13% with diabetes. And then in terms of their disease duration, I said 6 to 7 years was the median disease duration. 76% of them had a positive RF or positive CCP, and they were in the medium or severe disease activity. Their DAS score was 3.9 on average. And the CRP was a little bit elevated at 2.51 median on average. In terms of their medication, we had 13 that were on no DMARD. We had 77%.
As in treatment naive.
Yes, exactly.
Never had a DMARD.
Yeah. Exactly. So 13%, again, because we took everyone, right? And we had 77% that were on a non-biologic, and we had 38% that were on a biologic or small molecule. So small molecule. And I agree with you, prednisone was pretty high because it was 33%. That's because of all the reason I explained to you earlier.
Yeah. So before we kind of move on to results, can you explain for our listeners how the FDG uptake was assessed? You talk in the manuscript about presence of visually assessed FDG uptake versus sort of quantifying the uptake. Mm-hmm. Would you mind explaining that to us?
Absolutely. That was the fun part for me. So there are ways to assess the uptake that basically the computer can do, right? And it can look at every single segment of the heart. So they have a very defined way of, like, the cardiologist and the nuclear cardiologist, they have a way of assessing different segments in the heart. And so we had sort of computer generated quantification of each segment. And because we realized that the inflammation of the heart of our patients were not homogeneous, we had to figure out a better way to just say, well, It depends, right? Like not everyone is going to have the same joint inflamed. So the same thing in the heart. Not everyone is going to have the same segment inflamed. We basically looked at the mean SUV, which is how we quantified the inflammation. And then you look at the minimum, we looked at the mean, we looked at the maximum. And then after this quantification, we also looked at how it looked. And we had the cardiologist, the specialist in this type of imaging, look at it without knowing. So he was completely blinded to what the patient had. And then we could look at diffuse, they reported either diffuse inflammation or focal inflammation. And that's really on the image. And we had some example on the manuscript. Those are really cool images, honestly. And it really shows the inflammation in those patients who had zero symptom.
Tell us then what you found in these patients, some of whom were completely treatment naive. What did the hearts look like?
I want to say surprisingly, I think for me as a fellow, it was surprising, but cool at the same time, as someone who's wanting to report something, I think not surprisingly for Dr. Baton.
Yes.
There was, exactly right. There was some difference. There was a difference between, basically we saw inflammation in our patients. What was to me fascinating and so cool, and it has really helped me with my patients going forward, is to see that the inflammation in the heart was associated with the disease activity of our patients. I think that to me, that's what was the most intriguing. So in terms of number, if you want, we found 40%, so 39%, but like almost 40% of patients who had visually assessed inflammation of the heart. Of them, more than 50% had focal uptake versus 45% that had diffuse, which same thing. That's kind of interesting. It's not, we can miss it. And then the finding that to me was the coolest was the fact that it's associated with the disease activity of our patients. And once you see this in the big study, in the 119 patients, then what was really, really cool is to see, even though we had such a small number of patients in the prospective study, is to see that the patients that were on TNF inhibitor decreased, as well as the other one actually. But we saw that the patients who were put on medication decreased their inflammation of the heart. So we can say from the study, we saw that there was inflammation in a significant amount of patients with rheumatoid arthritis. We found that it was associated with the disease activity. And in that sub-study, we saw that it was also decreasing with step-up therapy. The thing that I forgot to mention is that we had also gotten some controls. Either they were friends or we had those controls, because we have other diseases that are evaluated with PET scan. And we saw that the inflammation in the heart was clearly significantly different from our RA patients and our patients, the control patients.
So it's probably not surprising to any of our listeners that it's bad for the heart to have chronic uncontrolled inflammation. And as rheumatologists, we've been preaching for a long time that treating to target is essential for RA, both for preserving the joint and, as you're showing us, Isabelle, to protect the heart. And to rheumatologists, that's not surprising because we know human physiology is all interconnected. I wanted to shift gears now and hear a bit more about your story, Isabelle. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about your journey as an international medical grad, as you moved to the US and retrained, as many of us have to do. And then once you kind of finished your training, when you moved to Colorado.
First of all, thank you for asking me about this study. I think it's one of the favorite study I've been involved in, and it's been so much fun to do this study and to talk about it. But in terms of my journey, so I did, as you heard earlier, I did residency in France. Before residency, I met who became my husband in India, and he was coming to the US. So to get the full diploma in France at the time, because it has changed, but at the time, you had to finish residency in France, which is why I finished my residency. And the residency is a specialized residency. So basically, it's residency and fellowship combined. So I finished rheumatology back in France. And Anip at the time went to the US to do another residency. So he had finished his residency in India. He did another residency in the US. And once he finished his residency, I was like, why don't you come to France? You're becoming an expert at doing residency, because he would have had to do a residency again. And he said, hell no, I've already done 2, so I'm done. And I was like, well, that's fair. And what happened is that I had done some research. I did some research in the US. And at the time, I wasn't sure that I wanted to become a rheumatologist. So I first did infectious disease at Sloan Kettering. I loved working on research in the US. I absolutely adored it. So that sort of became the reason I became a researcher. And then I finished my residency in France, but then realized that really what I loved the most was rheumatology when I moved back to the US. So that was a lot of back and forth, because I did 1 year as just a research fellow at Sloan Kettering, kind of putting my French training in parentheses just to make sure that I was doing the right move to come to the US and it wasn't just for love. And then I came back to France and I finished my residency, then came back for good in the US, where I did again a residency and then moved to Columbia University. I had twins and we were in a very small apartment, and we realized that we needed to be maybe in a smaller city, that New York was wonderful, but with kids, it was a little bit difficult. So we moved to Denver. I remember Annie told me, you choose, you're more difficult. And the way I chose where to go was I looked at the mountains in the US and I said, I want to go to a place that has both skiing and climbing. And so I looked at Wyoming, Montana, Washington State, and I applied there. And I was going to take a job in Montana. And then I went to National Jewish and my interview was just unbelievable. And I was just like, wow, I'm going to learn so much if I come here. And I did. I learned so much. I was absolutely in love with every single person I was working with. It had been amazing until my personal story, like that. If you want, we can go into this. But
so in, I guess, your early 40s, you then had kind of a life-changing series of events. And I would love for you to share that with our listeners, actually. I think it would be amazing.
Well, so exactly at 40 and 2 weeks, I found a wonderful birthday gift. But I think I have to backtrack a little bit. So at 40 and 2 weeks, I found a gigantic tumor on my breast. It was 8 centimeters. But I think I want to backtrack a little bit. What happened is that after, I think it was 2 or 3 years being into National Jewish, my kids were 3 years old. And I started realizing that I was supposedly sort of where I was going to be for the rest of my life. I was trying to get some fundings in research and I wasn't successful. And to be honest, I think that one of the reasons is that I didn't really have a mentor then in rheumatology, because I was at National Jewish and we didn't have a chief. But I had wonderful mentors in interstitial lung disease. And I think it was just a matter of time. I would have gotten funded. And I was working with other people who were themselves funded. So things were going well, but I started just looking at my life, and some people would call that burnout. Basically, things did not make sense anymore. I didn't know why I was there. I felt like I was just in a hamster wheel, and I didn't even want to be seeing patients. I just wanted to be in my office and working on this grant. And the relationship with Annie became worse and worse. And frankly, most likely because of me, because I didn't know what I was there for. Life didn't have joy in it. I had no relationship with my kids. I did not want to be around them. It's awful. Like I was in a hole. And at 40 and 2 weeks, I remember I was wondering if I should divorce. I was wondering what I was going to do with my life. And then I got this cancer. And the funny part, I mean, it's not funny, but I was in France when I got the diagnosis, because I had decided that I was going to go to France to get energy from my friends and family, because I was so sad for my midlife crisis. So I kind of offered myself this 40-year-old birthday gift to go to France alone. I saw my tumor like 2 days before I went. I got the biopsy the day before I went. And I took the flight saying that it's not going to change anything. I mean, it was pretty obvious. It was cancer. It was pretty obvious the lymph nodes were involved. And I got the diagnosis in France. And what's super interesting to me is that I am such a scientist, such a evidence-based medicine person. But the first person I went to see after this diagnosis was a naturopath. And it's so intriguing to me that I went to see a naturopath when literally, when patients I want to say that in the past, when patient came to me after seeing naturopath and that they had not done anything and they were still having so many disease inflammation. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like what are the naturopath doing? Those are charlatans. But actually I realized that they were not. Like it just depends on, like it's just the patient that's not ready yet to see Western medicine. So as a physician, I was ready to see Western medicine, but I wanted to talk to someone that I had seen that she had changed the life of one of my friends by just her words. And so I just saw her. And what she told me changed the way I practice medicine, because she told me to look at the cancer as not as an enemy, but as a friend who's here to tell you something. And that was mind blowing for two reasons. The first reason is that at that moment, this is exactly what I needed to hear. Because if I had been in a fighting mode, I would have used my energy to fight instead of healing. Seeing the cancer as a friend and not as an enemy helped me not fight my own body. I mean, this could be like several podcasts by itself, but really like a shift in this way of seeing the disease. And then the second thing it did to me is that I realized I was like, holy moly, like I've been wrong this whole time with my patients. Their disease is not what I'm after. My job as a physician is to help them get back to remission by going to the root of the issue. And yes, it may be rheumatoid arthritis, but how many of us in rheumatology have seen patients that have failed medication after medication? And you're always wondering, why is it that this one patient, it works right away versus this other patient, it doesn't work? And what I had already started experiencing as a physician is that I would ask my patient, can you think of anything that the rheumatoid arthritis, I'm taking rheumatoid arthritis, but it could be anything, has brought to you? Is there anything that this has brought to you that's positive? And I saw the shift in my patient's life where they had so many side effects before of medication, so they couldn't go on those medication. And suddenly they were able to be on those medication and continue those medication and finally be in remission. And so when this naturopath told me that, I was like, I know she's right for me. I'm not saying this is for everyone. I'm just saying at that moment, this was right for me. And what it did is that I started doing meditation, visualization, and my cancer journey. So it ended up being stage 4 with liver metastasis, bone metastasis. But my cancer journey was not painful. I don't know how to explain this. It wasn't painful because it was a journey. It was like, okay, I need to learn something from this. What can I learn? This is not a monster. And somehow I came to terms with the fact that I may die. And that was this possibility, but that anyway, all of us die at one point or the other. And during the time where I was undergoing chemo and surgery and radiation therapy, I actually had one of my long time, like not a very good friend, but someone I knew from high school who was young, healthy, and went on a camping trip and got eaten by a grizzly bear. And that day I was like, I'm so right. Like death can happen at any time. And so you're like, this is crazy. This guy did not have cancer. He did not have stage 4 cancer, yet he died. I had this realization. I was like, when it's time, it's time. So now my goal is to live the most fulfilling life with intent and purpose. And I shifted everything. I started creating connection in my life with my kids. We tried with Annie to create connection in our couple. It didn't work. We tried everything and it didn't work. And so then we are now very, very kind to each other. I think I actually, at least I would say I still love him. I'm just not in love with him. I have only good things about this incredible human being and doctor. But yeah, we are separated and we co-parent our kids very well. I met someone that's wonderful with whom I connect. very deeply. And then the third part was the job and realizing that what I was doing wasn't aligned with what I really wanted to do now that I had this life-changing event. And so that's why I opened the first direct care rheumatology practice in Denver, Colorado, because I was just like, I want to offer the best of me to my patients. And I cannot do this when I only have 45 or 60 minutes in the first visit, or 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes in the second visit. I need more. I need my patients to know that I'm here for them. So I decided to go without insurance so that I can offer the best. And so far, it's been incredible. Like, I'm absolutely loving what I do. And I think that that's a way that a lot of doctors can get out of burnout.
I truly appreciate you sharing your story with us, Isabel, and being so candid in what happened to you in all these different aspects of your life. I wanted actually to kind of pull you back to one of the things you said as you were beginning to tell us your story. You kind of talked about your mindset at that point in time, right before this diagnosis was made, where you felt that you were kind of on the brink of burnout and trying to figure out this meaning in midlife. And I wondered, now that you, in an incredible way, were able to sort of move your mindset upstream of that problem and think about and reflect on the challenges you were facing. Are there any things you are able to share with our audience, who some of whom may be experiencing similar challenges, things you wish you'd known or had clarity on that can help other people kind of go upstream of their challenges and figure out what's the right way forward?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Vicky. Thank you so much for asking this. So I think it's very personal. Two things. The number one is to realize when the ego is driving. And in academia, particularly, seeing our name as first author on a paper, it's all about the ego. There's a reason sometimes we really don't like people who are in academia, right? Because it's no, but that's true, right? Like, and I don't think I was as fun as I am now. I would say that. But then you start thinking, do I really like what I do? Because is this where my zone of genius is, right? And that's why I think we have to always wonder, am I saying yes to every single request because I'm trying to flatter my ego, or does that really align with what I want to do? And you were mentioning that there was a lot of fellows here that are listening. I think for fellows, it's really important to realize that what works really well for someone may not be our zone of genius for ourselves, right? So there are incredible researchers. And I mean, Dr. Baton is one of them. Dr. Giles is incredible as well. I have a lot at National Jewish that are incredible researchers. But maybe when it comes to us, are we really driven by the love of research, or is it just ego? And I personally realized at one point that one of the things that was driving me was like having my name as first author, having my name on PubMed. And when I got the cancer, I was like, those are useless. Like, I'm not going to carry them with me if I die. And my relationship are more important now. Again, very personal, because it might be the opposite, right? So I think that the thing that's really important is to stop like, if we can do it every day, it's better, but like to really make a point at stopping at that moment and being like, what is the life I want to create? Does this life makes me happy? And what do I need to get to this life? And what needs to change? It might be that, okay, well, I want to do more research, but why do you want to do more research? Is it because you want more time off, because you want to spend less time with patients, and then you're maybe spending less time with patients? Why is it that you don't want to spend as much time with patients? Is it reason A, B, C, D, right? Like, there's so many reasons. What aligns with you? And I think that those are the questions. Like, same thing in the relationship. If we don't work on our relationship, they don't work. Like, everything needs nurturing. I don't think work is the term, but nurturing. And the same way that we are very good at, I think doctors are excellent at forgetting their own needs and putting the needs of everyone else before them. And that's really funny, right? Like, I remember one of my very good friends now, she was a resident with me. And as a resident, I did not like her. It's funny. Then she became a fellow, and then I discovered her even more. And I was like, I love her, and she's an inspiration. As a resident, she would take days off to take care of herself. And at the time, I was really angry because I was like, why does she do that when all of us are working so hard? Now I can say that we should all have done this because it would have allowed us to just reflect on what do we need? What do we want? It's not a day or an hour that you're just doing something else. I'm very good at filling my schedule, but it's really a time where you're stopping and you're just thinking of what does my life looks like? Is it exactly where I want it to be? Or how do I want it to look like? And it's not the number of publication. It's not the title. It's really like, what gives me joy? And if it's research, and I know I will go back to research because I love it, but I will do it for the right reason. It's not for my name on PubMed. It's because I'm so excited about doing research in rheumatoid arthritis and interstitial lung disease, or rheumatoid patients post-COVID having brain fog, and so on. I don't know if that helps answer some of your question, but I think if I had taken the time, if someone had told me, this is actually vital, if you do not do this, life will do it for you. And I think if I had listened to that, and now I definitely do, I definitely stop very often to be like, okay, am I where I want to be?
I think it's incredibly good advice to all of us. And I really thank you for sharing it and for sharing that experience. I would like to talk for a couple minutes about how you practice now, because obviously you integrated some of the experiences that you yourself had, and it's really shaped how you're practicing now as a physician. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about that?
You're going to have to stop me because I love this. This is my favorite part. So there's several things. The first thing that came to my mind was I love my patients. I truly love them. I have less patients than when I was in insurance-based practice. But the relationship I have with them is a relationship that's built on trust and mutual understanding. And it sounds silly to say that, but because they are paying me, I know that they are valuing me. There is a direct relationship. It sounds silly to say that, but I really believe in this. I think that there's a direct healing effect that comes from transferring money to me directly. And I think it's sort of when you go to the therapist and you pay them, and I think it's a sort of the same, like you're going to the therapist, you're paying to heal you. And I think the patients are doing that. So I'm starting with this because my first fear was that this would destroy my relationship with patients. And instead of destroying it, I think it actually put it even stronger. Yeah. So that's number one.
And to be clear, you're a kind of direct care practice. So the patients pay your bills directly, not involving the insurance, but they could at a later point claim that cost back from their insurance. You give them a super bill and the necessary.
Yes, absolutely. So basically, I don't want to have to discuss how much I'm worth to each insurance. And so come to me, pay the fee, and then you can get a super bill from that fee, and then you'll get, or not, depending on what insurance they have, reimbursement from at least part of this fee. So yeah, absolutely, you're correct. But then they pay me for a whole year, and then they don't have to pay me after that, and it's unlimited visit. The funny part is a lot of people are like, don't they abuse the fact that they have your cell phone, your email, or that they know that they are coming? And I'm like, no, they are not. Actually, it's surprising. My patients are doing better than they ever have. And so they are bothering me. I mean, they never bother me, but they are not contacting me. And sometimes I'm like, are they okay? And so I'm like, can we make sure that are they okay? And they are not abusing. And I think it's just the fact that they know that I'm available and that I'm here. They don't need to reassure themselves that I'm here and that I'm actually able to respond to them in a timely fashion because they know that they have me. So that's number one. Number two is that I still do prior authorization and pharmacies that are helping with that. But like, it's not like their insurance is not going to cover their meds. Their insurance still cover their meds, still cover their labs, still cover their imaging. But it's really the relationship of me with them. And the reason for that was that if I had opened my own private practice with insurance, I would have had to start discussing with each of the insurance carrier how much I was worth. And I was like, I am not doing this. I don't want to have to do this, because then they don't pay you back. Then it just becomes like this hassle. And then you just have to do numbers. And I was like, I want to do quality and not quantity. I want to have a certain set of patients that I'm going to follow. That's going to be my family. And those are the patients that I'm going to see.
I think really great way to practice. And I'm sure there are others in our community of rheumatologists who would love to hear more about that. You do also incorporate into your practice some more holistic practices. Are you willing to share with our listeners about that?
Absolutely. So because during my cancer journey, I discovered a lot of other practices that are mostly Eastern medicine principle. I started looking at the science behind all of the things that I was doing. And the funny part was that I was having a fight between my left brain and my right brain the whole time I was doing them during my cancer journey. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I should have actually looked at the studies. But at the time I was so into it that I couldn't look. I didn't want to look at a study that would have told me it doesn't work. And so I didn't look. Once I was good, I looked at the studies and I was like, holy moly, everything is backed up by science. I wanted to do a study on visualization for rheumatoid arthritis. And I realized that there were many meta-analyses of visualization to decrease the disease activity and to see if they need less medication. So I asked my patient to do meditation, to do visualization, to exercise, but I explained to them why. And I think because I explained to them why, they are really buying in even more. And it's not like, oh my goodness, I don't have the time. I actually take the time to explain. And we talk
and
about
you can
it.
do that because you're not sort of limited within a system where you're seeing patients on the clock. And I think that's letting you take care of the whole person, right? Not just the synovium, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's exactly right. And I had started doing this even when I was in my institution, private institution, of asking patients, what is rheumatoid arthritis bringing you, or other diseases? So I had started doing that. I had already been blown away by the result of just a question like that. So it's possible to do even if you have a short amount of time. I think it's just wonderful to do when you have more time.
Yeah. And a lot of it is kind of changing your mindset of how you practice and recognizing that this is a matrix system, right? Your emotions play a role in how well your disease is controlled in response to medications.
I wanted to just share one thing because I think it was fascinating. There is a study currently looking at rheumatoid arthritis patients where they are stimulating the vagal nerve. That is the same stimulator that helps with epilepsy, so seizure disorder. I think seizure disorder for sure. I cannot remember PTSD. They are doing this, and what they're doing, they're stimulating the vagal nerve. But you can stimulate the vagal nerve with meditation, visualization, surrounding yourself with love, breathing exercise, humming. And it sounds silly. I sounded silly when I was asking my patients to do that at first. And then I started just embracing it and be like, you know what? My patients want this. They want to know what they can do. And it's actually been super empowering for them to have things that are not just medication.
Because it changes the locus of control, right? It gives them some ability to sort of modify outcomes outside of just the medication. And I think that's incredibly powerful for people. So I really want to thank you, Isabelle, for sharing your incredible life journey. I think you're now doing much better medically, and I really appreciate you being able to kind of look back on this experience and share it with our listeners. It was a pleasure to have you on the show today.
And thank you so much, Vicky, for having me on your show. And also, just thank you for doing this. It's such a cool podcast. So thank you so, so much.
So usually at this point in the show, I also give a special thank you to people who help the rheumatology community. But today, I'm going to ask you, the listeners, to do something instead. After this show ends, take a moment and reach out to an old friend and just check in. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRoom on social media and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.